Hello, I'm Callerdy Hutt, and today I want to talk to you about a current important event that is going on in our society. More specifically, I want to talk to you a little bit about the COVID-19 pandemic and how it is potentially causing food shortages and thus causing people's physiological needs to go unmet, and then why that is such a problem. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how these restrictions got put in place, and then where we are now with them, and then where we seem to be headed in the future. Now, to begin, let's talk a little bit about how this happened. But to start, I want you to think back to our book, The Checklist Manifesto. In that book, it talks about how complex problems are increasingly becoming the norm, and it gives an example of what that might look like. Now, in the book, we see medical professionals trying to save a woman who was drowned for 30 plus minutes, didn't get medical care for hours, and yet through some unconventional means perhaps, but still all the same, they are able to save this woman, and she's able to live a more or less stable life. So we see through this that while complex problems can be extreme and hard to grapple with, they are not unsolvable, and COVID-19 is no exception, thankfully. According to the podcast Dispatch 6 Feet, Dispatch 4 6 Feet, we have learned a little bit about COVID-19 through a study that was done with SARS and airplanes. Specifically, they found that the statistic for the amount of distance that SARS could spread was 6 feet from the person on the airline who was infected, or roughly a couple rows. And they chose to extrapolate that information, and they assume that it is working roughly the same way as SARS currently. So we think that the same distance holds for COVID-19. Now, so with that in place, we move a little bit into now. So once we had that 6-foot statistic, our government, according to the Register Guard, made it so that businesses who could not comply with the 6-foot distancing procedures would have to be closed. Now this sucks for everybody. It's bad to have no money and to be unemployed, but it's especially bad when you are causing food insecurity. And that's because it might end up impacting people's ability to meet their needs. So think back to the video that we watched called Why Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs Matters. In that video, it discusses how we have 5 base needs, and to complete the one above it, you have to first meet the bottom one. So to meet your safety needs, you have to meet your physiological. To meet your belongingness, you have to meet your safety, so on and so forth. Now, this is important because if you think about it, physiological needs include food. It's a base need. If you do not have food, you can't worry about these. And that is directly an issue when we're trying to deal with making people safe in a pandemic. If you are not able to meet your base needs for food and such, you're not worried about the safety. And we see an illustration of this in the video, A Grocery Store in the Epicenter of the Pandemic, where we see a man who is putting his safety at risk working in a high density, very popular supermarket in the middle of New York City. He is definitely exposed on a daily basis, but he doesn't have the ability to worry about that because at the core, he had to do it to make sure that both his kids and him had food on the table. And so at the end of the day, the physiological need was not met without him doing that, so he couldn't even worry about the next up need of safety. And so we see here that this is obviously not good. If we're having something that is preventing us from being able to effectively deal with our safety concerns in the pandemic, we need to deal with it. It's only going to get worse. So that takes us a little bit into the future and where we seem to be going. Now, in the article we read called How Hospitals Can Deal with Supply Shortages as Demand Surges, it talked about how hospitals could use some perhaps unconventional ways that technically would have worked before, but that we might not have considered the most straightforward or obvious solution. So For them, that included like sharing supply lines and information, things that were possible but were not really being done before this. And so before I go any further, I want to give you a slight allegory for that. So imagine you have a set of white clothes that you're washing. And once you put them in, you realize that you really need your red work shirt washed by the time you leave, and you just don't have enough time for those white clothes to be finished. Well, you're in a predicament. You can try to brute force through the barrier and use the more traditional way of washing it in your clothes washer. Yeah. But in doing so, you're going to have some unintended consequences. You're going to probably end up with pink clothes instead of white clothes at the end. So you're meeting your need in a very straightforward way, but the traditional approach is not working with the barrier in place. Alternatively, you could perhaps wash your socks in a way that doesn't really stick with your referent for what washes socks, but still again meets your needs. So, for example, you might find yourself washing your clothes and your shirt in your sink. It's perfectly safe. You'll have soap and water. It works. It's not something you would have done without the restrictions in place necessarily, but your needs are getting met, and without all of the explosive negative consequences of having all of your other clothes being infected with the red dye, so to speak. And so this speaks to the idea of unconventional and creative solutions, or that existed, but that were not considered valuable necessarily before, not frequently used. And this is what restaurants are doing now. We see, according to the Register Guard, which is a local newspaper, we see that there has been an increase in both takeout, no-touch takeout, and in no-touch delivery and in takeout, which are both ways to get around this, right? So the no-touch delivery means you don't even have to be within 6 feet. And the takeout also deals with the other aspect of the laws, which dealt with max persons in a business. So both of these are examples, of course, of the restaurant industry working creatively with what they had to meet people's needs, while still making sure that people are safe. And so, hopefully, by watching this presentation, I've informed you a little bit about the issue of COVID-19 and food security, and why, even if you might not be experiencing it personally, it can be a real threat to people's physiological needs in this harsh time. I talked a little bit about the procedures and how they got started. I talked about where those led us, and I talked about where we are going. And I hope that with that information, you can make informed decisions about your own food needs and stay safe in the future. Have a good week, guys.